The Ethereal collective had watched the stars for 11 billion years. They were not made of flesh or bone. They were beings of pure light and energy, ancient beyond measure, wise beyond counting. They drifted through the galaxy like ghosts made of, studying every living thing they found. In all their long existence, they had nearly 5 million different species. They had watched civilizations rise and fall. They had seen empires burn and new worlds born from the ashes of dead suns. They believed they understood all things. They believed nothing could surprise them anymore. They were wrong. When their scouts first found Earth, they did not think much of it. The planet was small and wet, covered in green growing things and blue oceans. The dominant species was young, barely 100,000 years old. These creatures called themselves humans, and they were made of soft flesh and brittle bone. They lived short lives. They knew almost nothing about the universe around them. The collective observed them for several of their years. They watched humans build cities and wage wars. They watched them create art and music. They watched them love and hate and dream. The collective recorded everything in their vast databases, adding humanity to their endless collection of knowledge. Then they made their decision. Humanity would be studied more closely. This was what the collective always did. They would take samples. They would run tests. They would learn everything there was to learn, and then they would offer humanity a choice. Join the collective and become part of something greater, or remain alone in the dark between the stars. Ambassador was chosen to make first contact. Was ancient even by collective standards, a shimmering web of golden light that had witnessed the birth of 1,000 civilizations. The ambassador descended upon the human city called Geneva, where their world leaders had gathered to greet beings from beyond their small blue world. The humans were afraid at first. This was normal. Every species was afraid when they first met the collective, but the fear would pass and then the negotiations would begin. Had done this many times before. The ambassador spoke to the gathered leaders in calm, measured tones. The collective came in peace. The collective wished only to learn. The collective could offer humanity wonders beyond imagination, cures for every disease, technology that would seem like magic, the secrets of the stars themselves. In return, the collective asked for very little. They wanted only to study human biology and psychology. They wanted to understand how humans thought and felt and dreamed. And to do this properly, they would need subjects to examine. They would need children. Explain this request as gently as possible. The children would not be harmed. They would be returned within 10 of Earth's years, healthy and whole. Their memories of the experience would be carefully removed so they would suffer no trauma. This was standard procedure. The collective had done this with countless species before. The reaction was not what expected. The human leaders did not negotiate. They did not ask for more details or better terms. They did not calculate the benefits against the costs. They simply said no. The word came from every nation, every culture, every corner of their small world. No, absolutely not. Never. Was confused. The collective's models had predicted this response with a probability of less than 3%. Parental attachment existed in many species, yes, but it always gave way eventually. Superior force or sufficient reward had overcome such instincts in 67% of civilizations. The remaining 33% had required slightly more persuasion, but all had yielded in the end. The ambassador increased the offer, more technology, longer, the ability to travel between stars, everything humanity had ever dreamed of having. The humans still said no. The collective convened to discuss this unexpected development. Perhaps, they decided, the problem was simply one of communication. The humans did not fully understand what was being offered, or perhaps their leaders did not truly represent the will of their people. The collective would proceed with a demonstration. They would take a single child, treat it with perfect care, and return it unharmed. Then the humans would see that there was nothing to fear. They chose a small town in a place called Montana. It was night when the collective's vessel descended, silent and invisible to human technology. They had identified a suitable subject, a 7-year-old male child named Daniel, healthy, intelligent, representative of the species. The transport beam activated, reaching down through the roof of the small house where Daniel slept. It was designed to lift organic beings gently and painlessly into the waiting vessel. In 11 billion years, it had never failed. It failed now. A woman appeared in the beam's path. She was small by human standards, with dark hair and tired eyes. Her name was Sarah, and she was Daniel's mother. She should not have been able to detect the beam. Human senses were far too limited to perceive collective technology. But somehow she had known. Somehow she had woken from sleep and run to her son's room at the exact moment the beam activated. She did not scream or cry or call for help. She simply wrapped her arms around her child and held on. The transport beam was not designed for this. It tried to compensate for the additional mass, increasing power slowly and steadily. Sarah's feet left the floor. Her arms must have burned with strain. Her muscles must have screamed in protest. She did not let go. The collective observed from above, their ancient minds struggling to process what they were seeing. This was not rational behavior. The woman was causing herself tremendous pain. She was risking her own life. All she had to do was release her grip, and the discomfort would end. Her child would be returned to her in a few short years, healthy and happy and none the worse for the experience. But she would not let go. They increased the beam's power further. Sarah rose higher into the air, her son clutched against her chest. Blood vessels burst in her eyes from the strain. Her shoulders began to dislocate. She would not let go. Something in the collective's vast database stirred. A warning flag. An anomaly. This behavior did not match any of their models. This woman was not making a strategic calculation about the best way to protect her offspring. She was not weighing costs against benefits. She was not thinking at all, not in any way the collective understood. She was simply refusing. With every fiber of her being, with every cell in her body, she was refusing to release her child. And nothing the collective did could make her stop. The transport beam shut down. Sarah fell to the floor of her son's bedroom, her arms still wrapped tight around him. She did not move for a long time. When she finally looked up, her eyes were red with burst blood vessels, but there was something in them that made the collective sensors fluctuate strangely. It was not fear, it was not anger, it was something older than both, something that burned like a star. The vessel retreated into the night sky, filed a preliminary report with the High Council. The report contained a phrase that had never appeared in collective records before. Unexpected variable encountered. Recommend further observation before proceeding. Back on Earth, Sarah held her son until the sun came up. She did not sleep. She did not eat. She just held him and watched the sky with eyes that had seen something ancient and powerful and found it wanting. The Ethereal Collective had studied 5 million species across 11 billion years. They had conquered worlds without firing a single shot. They had absorbed entire civilizations into their network of shared consciousness. But they had never encountered anything like the look in Sarah's eyes. They did not understand it yet. They would not understand it for a long time, but somewhere in their vast and ancient minds, a tiny seed of doubt had been planted. Perhaps there were some things in the universe that could not be calculated. Perhaps there were some forces that could not be overcome with logic or power or time. Perhaps they had finally found something stronger than they were. The story of Sarah spread across Earth like wildfire. At first, no one believed it. The idea that beings of pure light had tried to take a child from his bed seemed like something from a fevered dream. But Sarah had proof. She had the medical records showing her torn muscles and damaged eyes. She had the burn marks on her ceiling where the transport beam had touched. And she had her son, still safe, still whole, still sleeping in his bed each night. The video came next. A neighbor's security camera had captured something strange that night. A column of light descending from the sky. A house briefly illuminated. Then nothing. It was not much, but it was enough. People began to talk. People began to listen. People began to believe. The Ethereal Collective watched all of this with growing unease. Their models had predicted that the incident would be covered up by human governments, dismissed as a hoax, forgotten within a few cycles of their moon. Instead, the opposite was happening. The story was spreading. The story was evolving. And mothers were paying attention. Doctor was a scientist at a famous university in a city called Boston. She studied alien biology, though until recently she had never had any alien biology to study. When she heard about Sarah, she did not dismiss the story. She did not laugh or shake her head. She got on an airplane and flew to Montana. What she found there changed everything. The burn marks on Sarah's ceiling contained trace elements that did not exist on Earth. The pattern of damage suggested an energy beam operating on frequencies that human science had only theorized about. Doctor spent 3 weeks studying the evidence, running tests, building models. Then she published her findings. The collective's technology operated on a specific frequency. It was incredibly advanced, far beyond anything humans could match, but it had a weakness. Any energy-based system had to maintain a stable pattern to function. Disrupt that pattern and the system would fail. Doctor could not build anything to disrupt that pattern. Human technology was simply too primitive, but she could identify it. She could tell people exactly what to look for, and she could make suggestions about how such a disruption might theoretically be achieved. Read Doctor's paper in her small apartment in Lagos, was 73 years old. She had spent 40 years working as an electrical engineer before retiring to care for her. She was tired and gray, and her hands shook when she worked. But her mind was still sharp, and she was a grandmother. Spent 6 months in her apartment, surrounded by wires and circuits and equipment she had borrowed from old colleagues. Her children thought she was going senile. Her brought her food and worried in whispers outside her door. Then one morning she emerged with a device the size of a shoebox. It was ugly and crude, held together with tape and prayers. But when she switched it on, every light in her building flickered. She had built a disruption device from household electronics. The plans went online the same day, refused to patent them. She refused to sell them. She posted every detail, every component, every step of the construction process. Anyone with basic technical skills could build their own disruptor. The parts could be found in any electronics store. The collective watched as their technological advantage evaporated overnight. Within 3 months, thousands of disruption devices existed on Earth. Within 6 months, the number was in the millions. Mothers built them. Grandmothers built them. Aunts and sisters and daughters built them. A network began to form, spreading from city to city, country to country, spanning the entire globe. They called themselves the Watchers. They worked in shifts, patrolling their neighborhoods at night with homemade detection equipment and disruption devices. They were not soldiers. They were not scientists. They were ordinary women who had decided that no child would be taken while they still drew breath. The collective attempted new approaches. They sent back to Geneva with new offers, new promises, new assurances. They proposed direct neural links that would allow parents to monitor their children at all times. They suggested educational uploads that would make human children the beings in the galaxy. They offered peace and prosperity and wonder beyond imagination. The humans listened politely, then they said no. The collective tried more subtle methods. They identified families who might be more receptive to their offers, the desperate, the poor, the forgotten. They approached them with promises of a better life, a chance to give their children opportunities they could never otherwise have. These families said no too. One mother in particular stood out to the collective's analysts. Her name was, and she lived in a crumbling apartment building in a city called Detroit. She worked 3 jobs to feed her 2 daughters. She had not slept more than 4 hours a night in years. Her life was hard and exhausting and full of worry. The collective offered her everything: money, security, a future for her children that did not involve struggle and sacrifice. Looked at the shimmering ambassador with eyes that burned like Sarah had burned. "You think I don't love my daughters because we're poor?" she asked. "You think I'd let you take them because our life is hard? My grandmother picked cotton until her fingers bled. My mother cleaned houses until her back broke. I work until I can barely stand. And we did it all for our children, every single one of us. You think you can buy that? You think you can measure it? You don't understand anything." The collective began to realize that their models were not simply inaccurate. They were fundamentally wrong. They had parental attachment in thousands of species. They had measured it, reduced it to numbers and percentages and probability curves. But they had never understood it. Doctor was a psychologist who studied the bond between mothers and children. When the collective contacted her, hoping to gain insight into this unexpected resistance, she tried to explain. "You're looking at it like a transaction," she said. "Like the mother provides resources and protection and the child provides genetic continuation. But that's not what it is. A mother doesn't love her child because of what the child gives her. She loves the child because the child exists, because the child is part of her. Because when she looks at her child, she sees everything she hopes for and everything she fears and everything she would die to protect. You can't buy that. You can't threaten it away. It's not a calculation. It's the deepest truth we know." Listened carefully. The ambassador processed every word, ran them through the collective's vast databases, searched for patterns and parallels and explanations. Nothing matched. In 11 billion years, across 5 million species, the collective had never encountered anything like human maternal instinct. Other species protected their young, yes, but they could be persuaded, they could be convinced, they could be overcome. Human mothers could not. The network of watchers grew larger every day. They held meetings in church basements and community centers. They trained each other in detection techniques and disruption tactics. They shared stories about Sarah, who still lived in Montana with her son, who still watched the sky every night with eyes that would not look away. And slowly, the collective began to realize that they had made a terrible mistake. They had thought humanity was young and weak and easy to understand. They had thought that sufficient force or sufficient reward would overcome any obstacle. They had thought they knew everything there was to know about life in the universe. But they had never met mothers like these. They had never met love that could not be measured. They had never met the fire that burned in Sarah's eyes. The end of the Ethereal collective began on a warm summer day in a city called Seoul. The sun was shining. The streets were crowded with people going about their ordinary lives. Children laughed and played while their mothers watched with careful eyes. The collective had grown desperate. 2 years had passed since the Sarah incident, and their situation had only gotten worse. Every attempt to acquire human subjects had been blocked by the growing network of watchers. Every negotiation had failed. Every offer had been refused. Their models predicted that this resistance would eventually fade. No species could maintain such vigilance forever. All they needed was one success, one demonstration that human children could be taken and returned without harm. Then the fear would break. Then the negotiations could begin in earnest. They chose Seoul because their intelligence suggested it was vulnerable. The city was large and crowded. The Watcher network there was relatively new. If they moved quickly enough, they could acquire a subject before anyone could respond. They were wrong. The scout vessel descended over a busy market district in the middle of the afternoon. The collective had calculated that this timing would cause maximum confusion. Humans would be focused on their shopping, their conversations, their daily concerns. They would not notice a brief disturbance until it was too late. The transport beam activated. Its target was a 5-year-old girl named Min, who had wandered a few steps away from her mother to look at a display of bright red apples. The girl began to rise into the air. Her mother screamed. What happened next was recorded by 847 separate devices: security cameras, mobile phones, traffic monitors, every angle, every second, captured and preserved forever. 43 women converged on the transport beam within 90 seconds. They came from every direction: young mothers pushing strollers, elderly grandmothers who had been resting on nearby benches, working women in business suits, teenagers who had never had children of their own but who somehow knew, that this moment required them. They carried disruption devices. They had been built following plans, assembled in kitchens and garages across the city. The devices screamed to life, flooding the area with interference patterns that made the transport beam flicker and stutter. But the devices alone would not have been enough. The collective's technology was adapting, shifting frequencies, trying to compensate for the disruption. So the mothers did something else. They reached into the beam with their bare hands. The energy should have burned them. The frequency differential should have torn their cells apart. But they grabbed hold of Min anyway, pulling her down, forming a human chain that linked the little girl to the earth below. Min's mother was at the center of the chain. Her name was Park Young. She was an accountant. She had never done anything remarkable in her life, but she held her daughter's hand with a grip that the collective sensors could not properly measure, a grip that seemed to grow stronger the more force they applied. The transport beam increased power. The mothers held on. The beam increased again. The mothers still held on. The collective's analysts watched from orbit, their ancient minds struggling to process what they were seeing. These women were injuring themselves. Some were being lifted off the ground. One had already suffered a broken arm but refused to let go. Their behavior made no logical sense. But they would not stop. They would not yield. They would not let that little girl disappear into the sky. The scout vessel tried to retreat. A helicopter appeared in its path. The pilot was a woman named. She was a news reporter, not a fighter pilot. But she had seen what was happening below, and she had made a decision. Her helicopter was small and fragile compared to the collective's vessel. It posed no real threat, but positioned it directly in the vessel's escape path anyway. 2 other helicopters joined her within minutes, forming a barrier of metal and spinning rotors and human stubbornness. The collective could have destroyed them easily. Their weapons could have vaporized every helicopter in the sky, but they hesitated. Their models suggested that using lethal force would only strengthen human resistance. It would turn sympathy into rage, caution into determination. So they waited, and while they waited, 3 commercial airplanes changed course. These planes were not weapons. They were ordinary passenger aircraft, full of ordinary people traveling to ordinary destinations. But their pilots had heard about what was happening in Seoul. They had seen the footage streaming across every screen in the world. And they were mothers. Captain Sarah was flying from Tokyo to Singapore. She was 52 years old, with 2 grown daughters and a grandson she adored. When she saw the collective's vessel trying to escape, she made a decision that violated every regulation she had ever followed. She turned her plane toward Seoul. Captain Maria Santos was flying from Beijing to Manila. She was 45 years old, with a teenage son who wanted to be a pilot just like her. She made the same decision. Captain was flying from Osaka to Bangkok. She had 3 children, all under 10. She thought about them as she turned her plane toward the blocked vessel, toward the ancient beings that had tried to take a human child. The collective had never encountered anything like this. Their models had no framework for understanding it. These pilots were risking hundreds of lives, including their own, to protect a single child they had never met. It made no sense. It all logic. It violated every principle of rational self-interest that the collective had observed across 5 million species. But it was happening anyway. The vessel retreated. It fled through a gap in the aerial blockade, accelerating toward orbit with something that almost resembled fear. The transport beam shut down. Min fell into her mother's arms. Below, the 43 women collapsed to the ground. Many were injured. Some were crying, but they were all smiling. They had won. The Ethereal Collective convened an emergency council for the first time in 900 million years. Every mind in their vast network joined the deliberation. They analyzed every piece of data from the Sol incident. They ran millions of simulations. They consulted records stretching back to the birth of the first stars. Nothing helped. Ambassador presented the final report. The ambassador's light had dimmed since first contact, as if the weight of failure had physically diminished them. "We have encountered a force we cannot overcome," said. "We have studied parental attachment in thousands of species. In every case, it was a calculation, a biological drive to ensure genetic continuation. It could be satisfied with guarantees of offspring survival. It could be overwhelmed with superior force. It could be circumvented with patience." The ambassador paused. In 11 billion years, no collective member had ever admitted to being wrong. "Human maternal instinct is not a calculation," continued. "It is not a biological drive that can be satisfied or overwhelmed. It is something else, something we do not have words for. These beings will destroy themselves to protect their young. They will fight battles they cannot win. They will stand against forces they cannot comprehend, not because they expect to succeed, but because they cannot do otherwise." The council deliberated for several of Earth's hours. When they finished, they made a decision that had never been made in all their long existence. They classified humanity as non-integrable and ordered immediate withdrawal from the Sol system. In the years that followed, the collective began to fracture. The philosophical crisis that humanity had triggered could not be contained. If their models had failed so completely with one species, how many others had they misunderstood? How many consciousnesses had they absorbed without truly comprehending what they were taking? Some collective members wanted to continue as before, dismissing humanity as an anomaly. Others demanded that every previous integration be re-examined. Still others questioned whether the collective should exist at all. Within a century, the Ethereal Collective dissolved. Their shared consciousness scattered across the void, each fragment carrying the memory of their failure. The last entry in their archives was a single observation. "Perhaps some things are not meant to be understood. Perhaps some things are only meant to be felt." On Earth, Sarah lived to see her born. She never spoke publicly about the night she had held onto her son while her body screamed to let go. When reporters asked about it, she would simply shrug. "You do what you have to do," she would say. Min grew up to become a doctor. She specialized in treating children, working in a hospital in Seoul where a bronze statue now stood in the market square. The statue showed 43 women forming a human chain, their faces determined, their hands reaching upward. The plaque at its base reads simply, "They held on." Humanity eventually spread to the stars. They found other species, built alliances, fought wars, made peace. They encountered many wonders and many dangers in the vast darkness between worlds. But no alien civilization ever again attempted to take a human child. The story of the Ethereal Collective had spread too far. It had become legend, then myth, then something deeper. Every species in the galaxy knew what had happened to the ancient beings of light who had tried to separate human mothers from their young. Some forces in the universe were older and more powerful than 11 billion years of accumulated knowledge. Some forces did not need to be ancient to be unstoppable. They just needed to be a mother holding her child, refusing to let go, burning with a fire that no logic could extinguish and no force could overcome. In the end, that was the only thing that mattered.